My uncle stood up at the board meeting, slid a stack of papers across the table, and told me that the company my father built with his own hands had just been sold out from under me for $18 million, and that I had until the end of the month to clear out my office. He was smiling when he said it. He had spent 18 months secretly arranging this with a private equity firm, and he was certain he had won, because he thought I was just a sentimental woman who happened to run the factory floor and had no understanding of how ownership actually worked. What my uncle did not know, what my father had made very sure he would not know, was that the man who founded this company had seen this exact betrayal coming and had quietly built a trap for it years before he died. My name is Grace Okonkwo Bauer. I'm 41 years old, and I run a precision parts manufacturing company called Bauer Precision. And this is the story of how my uncle tried to sell my family's legacy out from under 300 employees, and how my late father reached forward from beyond the grave to stop him. Let me tell you about the company first, because you cannot understand the betrayal without understanding what was being betrayed. Bauer Precision was founded by my father, Carl Bauer, 43 years ago, in a rented garage with one machine and a single contract. My father was an engineer and an immigrant, a man who believed that the highest thing a person could do was make something real with their hands, something precise, something that worked, something that lasted. He built the company one impossible contract at a time, machining the small, exacting metal components that go into aerospace systems and medical devices, the kind of parts where a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch is the difference between working and failing. Over 40 years, that garage became a real factory, employing 300 people, many of them for their entire careers, many of them the children of people who'd also worked there. It was, by the end, worth around $30 million. But to my father, it was never about the 30 million, it was about the 300 families, and the thing they made together, and the name on the building. I grew factory floor beside my father, learning the machines, learning the people, learning the difference between a part that was good enough and a part that was right. My father taught me to read an engineering drawing before he taught me to drive. He used to say, "Grace, anyone can run a company from an office. To run it from the floor, that is the only way that lasts." And so I learned it from the floor. I started as a machinist. I worked every station. By the time I was 35, I was running operations, and by the time my father's health began to fail, I was running the company in everything but title, and he knew it, and the 300 people who worked there knew it. I remember one evening, when I was maybe 12, staying late with him because a critical aerospace part had failed inspection and a customer was waiting. My father did not blame the machinist who'd made it. He sat down at the machine himself at 60 years old, and he reran the part, slowly talking me through every cut, until it came off the machine perfect. And then he walked it over to the machinist station and left it there with a note that just said like this: "You can do it." He didn't humiliate the man, he showed him. The next morning, that machinist made 40 perfect parts in a row, and he worked for my father for another 20 years, and he was one of the people crying at my father's funeral. That was what my father understood that my uncle never could, that a company is not the machines, and it is not the building, and it is certainly not the share price. It is the people and what you teach them and whether they trust you. You cannot put that on a balance sheet, but it is the only thing that actually makes a company worth anything. There was someone else in the family though, my father's younger brother, my uncle Roland. Roland was not a builder. Roland was, as he liked to call himself, a finance man. He had never worked a day on the factory floor in his life. He found the whole enterprise of making things slightly grubby beneath him, a quaint thing that his immigrant brother did because he didn't know better. Years earlier, during a hard stretch, my father had let Roland buy into the company. A minority stake, a way to bring some family money in during a lean year. My father, I think, hoped it would bring them closer. It did the opposite. Roland came to see his minority shareholding not as a responsibility to the company, but as an asset to be maximized. A number on a page that he was perpetually annoyed wasn't a bigger number. He pushed, for years, for my father to sell, to unlock the value, to cash out and walk away. My father refused, every time, because to my father, the company was not value to be unlocked. It was people to be protected. My father passed away 2 years ago. And I want to tell you about something he did about 18 months before that, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns, though I did not understand its importance at the time. In his last clear years, my father became very interested, suddenly, in the legal structure of the company's ownership. He spent a great deal of time with his attorney, a sharp and discreet woman named Patricia Reyes, who had handled his affairs for 2 decades. He restructured things, quietly, carefully, telling almost no one the details. At the time, I assumed it was ordinary estate planning, the kind of tidying up a man does when he knows his time is limited. I did not pry. I was busy running the company, and my father was a private man about money. I knew only that he had put some protections in place, as he vaguely told me once, and that he wanted me to promise him something. I remember the conversation more clearly than almost any other from those last months. It was evening, and he was tired in the way he was always tired by then, and he asked me to sit with him. He didn't talk about the cancer, he talked about the company. He asked me, quietly, whether I loved it, not whether I was good at running it, which he knew, but whether I loved it, the actual work of it, the smell of cutting oil and the sound of the floor. And I told him the truth, that I did, that I couldn't imagine my life without it. He nodded, like a man confirming something he'd already bet on. And then he took my hand. His hands were still strong, machinist's hands, even at the end. And he said, "Grace, promise me you will never sell this company out from under the people who built it. Promise me you will run it from the floor." And I promised. I thought it was just a dying man's sentiment, the kind of thing you say. I did not understand then that he had spent his final, lucid energy making sure I would be able to keep that promise, no matter what my uncle tried. He wasn't asking me for a feeling. He was handing me a duty, and he had already built the armor I'd need to carry it. Because my father knew his brother. He knew Roland exactly. After my father died, I became, as everyone expected, the head of the company, the chief executive, running operations as I always had. Roland remained a minority shareholder, his stake unchanged. For a while, things were quiet. Roland made his usual noises about exploring strategic options, and I made my usual responses about honoring my father's wishes. And I assumed we had reached the same stalemate he'd had with my father for years. I was wrong. Because while I was running the company, Roland was secretly working to take it from me. Here is what he did, and I only assembled the full picture later. Roland made contact with a private equity firm, I'll call them Crestline Capital, that specialized in exactly the kind of acquisition that destroys companies like ours. Their model was not to build. Their model was to buy a healthy, family-run manufacturer, load it with debt, slash the workforce, sell off the real estate, squeeze every dollar of short-term value out of 40 years of careful work, and move on, leaving a hollowed-out shell and 300 unemployed people behind. They had done it to other companies. They wanted to do it to ours. And Roland, my father's own brother, was not only willing to let them, he was the one who had gone looking for them. Over the course of about 18 months, in secret, Roland and Crestline built their plan. The plan was to force a sale. Roland's theory was that between his own minority stake and the support he believed he could pressure or persuade from other family members who held small shares, my father had distributed modest stakes to a few relatives over the years. He could assemble enough of a voting bloc to override me and push through a sale to Crestline. The offer Crestline was prepared to make was $18 million, for a company worth $30. A lowball offer, deliberately, because Roland's deal with Crestline included a side arrangement, a generous consulting agreement, and a personal payout to Roland that would more than make up, for him personally, the difference between the lowball price and the real value. He was willing to sell the whole company for far less than it was worth, because he had arranged to be paid, separately and personally, to betray it. The 300 families were not even a line item in his thinking. They were simply in the way. The board meeting was where he chose to spring it. He had timed everything, assembled his proxies, gotten his commitments from the relatives he'd worked on, lined up Crestline's paperwork, and he called for that board meeting believing it would be the coronation of his 18-month scheme. He walked in like a man who had already won, and in a sense, he had done his homework. If the company's ownership had been structured the way he believed it was structured, the way it had been structured for most of its history, his math might even have worked. But my father had changed the structure, and Roland did not know. Let me tell you what that board meeting was like, because I will remember it for the rest of my life. Roland arrived with a lawyer of his own and a representative from Crestline, which should have been my first clue, but I genuinely did not see it coming. I thought we were having a routine quarterly meeting. He let the routine items proceed for a while, savoring it, I think. And then, with theatrical gravity, he stood, and he announced that he was exercising his rights as a significant shareholder to bring a resolution before the board, the sale of Bauer Precision to Crestline Capital for $18 million. He slid the stack of papers across the table to me. He announced, already secured the support of enough shareholders to carry the vote. He looked at me with an expression of profound, satisfied condescension, and he said, I quote him exactly, "I know this is emotional for you, Grace. You've done a fine job keeping the lights on. But this was always going to happen. The grown-ups are handling it now. You should start thinking about clearing your office by the end of the month. The grown-ups are handling it now." To the woman who had run the company from the floor for a decade, who had grown up in that factory, who had kept 300 people employed through every hard season since my father got sick, I did not raise my voice. I have learned that the people who are certain they've won are most unsettled by calm. I let him finish. I let him have his moment. And then I said, Roland, before we vote, I think we should make sure everyone in this room actually understands who owns this company, because I don't think you do. And I asked Patricia Reyes, my father's attorney, whom I had invited to this routine meeting for reasons Roland did not yet understand, to explain the ownership structure at Bauer Precision. Patricia opened her folder, and she explained calmly and precisely what my father had done in those quiet months, 18 months before he died. My father, she explained, had restructured the ownership of the company into a trust, not an unusual thing on its surface, but the terms of the trust were everything. My father had placed his controlling interest, the majority of the company, into a trust whose terms specified that the controlling votes would be held, and could only be held, by the person serving as the active operational head of the company, not the largest individual shareholder, not the cleverest finance man, the person actually running Bauer Precision. From the floor, day to day, my father had written his deepest belief directly into the legal bones of the company, that control belonged to whoever was doing the work of keeping it alive. And since the day my father died, that person had been me. Patricia said it plainly, for the room. The controlling interest in this company is held in trust, and the voting rights attached to it belong to the operational chief executive. That is Miss Okonkwo Bauer. It is not a matter of how many shares anyone in this room holds. The control was settled by Carl Bauer himself 18 months before his death, and it is not subject to a shareholder vote. There is no mechanism by which a minority shareholder, or any combination of them, can override it. She set the document down. This proposed sale cannot proceed without Miss Okonkwo Bauer's consent. As a matter of law, the room went very quiet. Roland's stake, his minority shareholding, the one he'd been so sure he could combine with his assembled proxies to force a sale, was, against the trust's controlling interest, not nearly enough. The proxies he had so carefully gathered from the other relatives, even all together, did not come close. My father had structured it precisely so that no combination of minority shareholders could ever override the person running the company. The whole scheme that Roland and Crestline had spent 18 months building rested on an assumption about who controlled Bauer Precision, and that assumption had been quietly made false by my father a year and a half before Roland ever made his first secret call to Crestline. I watched my uncle's face as Patricia spoke. I watched the condescension curdle into confusion, and the confusion into the dawning, sickening understanding of a man who has just realized that the ground he has been standing on so confidently was never there at all. He actually reached out and pulled the trust document toward himself, reading it, his lips moving slightly, as though if he read it carefully enough, it might say something other than what it said. It did not. He turned to his own lawyer, who was reading her own copy with the expression of a person calculating how to tell a client that there was nothing to be done. The Crestline representative had gone very still, the stillness of a man who has just understood that the deal he came to close does not exist and never did, and who is now mostly hoping to leave the room without being associated with whatever this was about to become. As the operational head of this company, I said, into the silence, I hold the controlling vote, and I am exercising it now. The answer to the proposed sale to Crestline Capital is no. It will always be no. This company is not for sale, not for 18 million, and not for 30, and not for any number, because it is not a number. It is 300 families and 40 years of my father's life, and I made him a promise. Then I turned to the Crestline representative, and I said, with all the politeness I could manage, that I thought it was time for him to leave, as there was no longer any business for him here, and there never really had been. But I was not quite finished with my uncle. because the betrayal was bad enough on its own, but the side deal, the personal payout he'd arranged to enrich himself while gutting the company, was the part I could not let stand. "Roland," I said, "I also think the board should be aware of the consulting agreement and personal compensation that Crestline agreed to pay you, separately, in exchange for delivering this sale, because that rather changes the complexion of your concern for shareholder value, doesn't it? You weren't trying to get the best price for this company. You negotiated a low price on purpose because you were being paid personally on the side to betray it." I had the documentation. I'll come to how I got it, and I laid it on the table. The other relatives, the ones whose proxies Roland had gathered with appeals to family loyalty and good business sense, were now looking at my uncle with an expression I can only describe as the moment a spell breaks. Here's how I had the documentation, because it matters. About a month before that board meeting, I had begun to sense that something was wrong. Roland was being too quiet, too pleasant. A man who has objected to your leadership for years does not suddenly go calm unless he believes he no longer needs to argue. So I had quietly gone to Patricia, and I had also gone to my father's oldest friend at the company, our longtime floor foreman, a man named Hank, who had been with my father since nearly the beginning and who heard everything that happened in that building. And it was Hank who told me that a relative had been seen, more than once, meeting with men in suits who'd been asking pointed questions around the industry about Bauer Precision's finances. I remember sitting with Hank in the break room after the second shift had gone home. The floor quiet, the machines cooling. He was nearly 70 by then, still came in every day, and when he told me what he'd heard, he didn't say it like a man passing on gossip. He said it like a man defending his home. "Grace," he said, "I started here when your dad had 3 machines and couldn't make payroll some weeks, and he never once let any of us go hungry. He'd skip his own check first. Whoever these suit fellows are, they don't build anything. I know the type. They take. You tell me what you need from me and the floor, and it's yours. Every one of us." And I realized, sitting there, that this was the thing Roland would never understand and could never buy. That 300 people would stand with the company, not because of a share price, but because of 40 years of a man skipping his own paycheck so they could keep theirs. That loyalty was not on any balance sheet Crestline had reviewed. It was the most valuable asset the company had, and Roland had not even counted it. That was enough. Patricia and I began, quietly, to prepare, to assemble the trust documentation, to understand exactly what protections my father had built, and to gather what we could about who Roland was talking to. We were not certain what was coming, but we were ready when it came. My father had taught me that too. You do not wait until the storm arrives to find out whether your roof holds. Here is what happened after. The sale to Crestline died in that room and was never revived, because it could not be. There was no legal path to it, and there never had been. Crestline, uninterested in a company they couldn't strip, moved on to easier prey. My uncle Roland's position collapsed entirely. The relatives whose support he had assembled withdrew it the moment they understood he had been planning to enrich himself personally while selling their family's legacy for a fraction of its worth. Roland remained, legally, a minority shareholder. My father's structure did not erase his stake, but his influence was finished. He had revealed himself completely in front of the entire board and family, and there is no coming back from being seen that clearly. I am told he sold his shares not long after, to a buyer I approved, and left the family's orbit. I do not hear from him. I find I don't need to. The company is thriving. We did not lay off 300 people. We did not get loaded with debt and hollowed out and sold for parts. Bauer Precision is still making the small, exacting components that my father spent his life perfecting, still employing the families who depend on it, still running. As my father insisted, from the floor, I kept my promise. I did one thing afterward that I think my father would have been proudest of. I worked with Patricia to extend the principle of his trust even further, to create a structure that, over time, gives the employees themselves a growing ownership stake in the company. The people who build the thing should own a piece of the thing. It is what my father believed, written even more deeply now into the legal bones of Bauer Precision, so that no future finance man, no future Roland, can ever again treat 300 livelihoods as a number to be unlocked. My father protected the company from one betrayal. I intend to protect it from all the ones that haven't been imagined yet. I want to leave you with the thing my father taught me, the thing that turned out to be the whole secret. People who see a company as only a number make a predictable mistake. They assume everyone else sees it that way too. My uncle could not conceive that my father would build the company's legal structure around a principle, instead of around a price. because Roland had never in his life valued a principle over a price, and he could not imagine anyone who did, so he never thought to check. He spent 18 months building an elaborate scheme on top of an assumption he never bothered to verify, because verifying it would have required him to understand a kind of man he was constitutionally unable to understand. A man who would quietly spend his final strength making sure that the thing he loved could never be sold by someone who only loved money. My father did not beat my uncle with a better scheme. He beat him with a deeper value-made law. And a value-made law is the hardest thing in the world to defeat. My name is Grace Okonkwo Bauer. My uncle tried to sell my father's life's work out from under 300 families and told me to clear out my office. He forgot to find out who actually owned the company he was so sure he could sell. My father didn't. And from beyond the grave, my father made sure that the company would always belong to whoever was willing to build it, and never to anyone who only wanted to sell it. If this story meant something to you, stay a while. There are more like it here. Stories about the people who do the real work, the builders and the keepers, and the calm, patient, perfectly structured moment. The ones who only wanted to cash out discovered that the house was never theirs to sell. No shouting, no drama, just a promise kept and a value made into law. Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.